Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is part 4 of the book Thomas Paine's Revolt Against the Bible, and it is book number 1205. Now, I usually show the book, but these books are so old that this one is falling apart as I read it, so I really can't show it to you, and I'm going to have to read part 4 and then possibly end it there. So here we go, Chapter 4, The Age of Unreason, from the book Thomas Paine's Revolt Against the Bible, Little Blue Book number 1205. And here we go. In a large biography of such a man as Paine, you cannot see the wood for trees. You lose your way amongst the tombstones of his ancestors and dates and names of obscure places and personalities. Put briefly, in its broad outline, Paine's life has an immense significance and instructiveness. He was in himself quite a symbolical figure. In him, the new idealism of the world was incarnated, and he fairly discloses its real roots to us. It is true that he gives a rather false or misleading expression to his root principle, the rights of man, in saying that men have equal rights because all have a common father, God, a common mother, earth. Would do just as well. But these questions of parentage are really academic and futile. Like every other reformer of the time, whether Christian, there were one or two in the entire legion, deist or atheist, Paine fought for the rights of man out of purely human sentiment. And those rights had not been recognized in the earlier Christian centuries, because, as John Locke, deist, had first pointed out, reason was not consulted. Paine is thus one of the most instructive figures in one of the most instructive periods of history, with every regard for the services of Washington, Jefferson, and their contemporaries. There is a true sense in which it may be held that America ought to be more proud of Paine than any other citizen at the time of its birth. The glibness with which American preachers still flaunt their moth-eaten calumnies against him is a disgrace. Happily, a saner attitude is being slowly created by the Thomas Paine Memorial Association, and it will soon be impossible for a reasonable man to commit such a solecism as to call Paine a dirty little atheist. He was not even little. He was above the average height, one writer says, about 5 feet 9. And atheism he dreaded and fought as earnestly as any Christian orator. Whether he ever had those ungraceful features of personality which are made the pretext for refusing him the honor he deserves, whether he was dirty and drunken, will be candidly considered when the time comes. We are now, remember, nearing the 16th year of his life, and even Chalmers' venomous and meticulous libel of him does not make such a statement. Even in his youth, as an exciseman, living in an atmosphere of beer and brandy, he was able to say to his superiors, he would promptly have retorted if the claim had been false, that no charge of intemperance had been made against him. That was in an age when certainly the majority of men who would afford it got drunk habitually, and no one cared. Just about the time that we have reached in the last decade of the 18th century, all England one day laughed over an incident of parliamentary life of the preceding night. Fox was to attack Pitt, but Pitt was drunk to the stage of vomiting. He remained at the open door of the House, listening to Fox and occasionally putting his head outside to vomit, then returned to the benches to answer his great rival. This was the most brilliant statesman in the world at the opening of the 19th century. Paine had hitherto remained entirely sober in this drunken world, and as to other personal habits, we have only to recall the company he kept. He had for more than 10 years met on equal terms the most distinguished men of America, England, and France. This was his position still in 1793. Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who lived in the same house with him in Paris, wrote to his mother There is a simplicity of manner, a goodness of heart, and a strength of mind in him that I never knew a man before possess. After a time, Paine secured a delightful little house in the Faubourg Saint Denis, which had once belonged to Mimi de Pompadour, and he held a kind of court of intellectuals. Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the finest of English women at the time, Sir Robert Smith, the English banker, and Lady Smith, Joel Barlow, the American poet, Lord E. Fitzgerald, and other English and Americans met the leading French politicians there. This was in the first half of the year 1793. The turning point of the Revolution had not yet reached. But there were heavy clouds on the horizon. The nobles and priests who had fled abroad were stirring foreign powers everywhere to move bloodily against the Republic. Men like Burke were lying about it. That's it. Emphasis on the wrong thing. The king had attempted to join the fugitives abroad, and a demand spread that since the intrigue abroad centered on him, he should be removed, while Danton, Condorcet, Sieyes, and Paine were placidly composing the new constitution. The country was slowly rising to the red heat, which would presently be a white heat, and the cries of fatherland and danger and death to traitors passed from mouth to ear. It is well known how Paine endeavored with all his energy to prevent the execution of the king. It looked, indeed, at one time as if a great speech of his in the convention on January 19th would save the king, and in proportion to his humanity, Paine annoyed the extremists, omitting the jargon of the history of the time, which is scarcely intelligible to readers of our day. Let us say that there was the usual division into extremists, the men who wanted strong measures, and moderates. The moderates with whom Paine was associated, though they thought him too idealistic and quixotic. It was then that Danton spoke to him the famous phrase that you cannot make revolutions without rosewater, were in power, and Paine used his influence to secure the escape of more than one Englishman. One Englishman he got off had struck him in the face. In the case of another, Paine offered his own life if the man did not, on being released, leave the country. A law expelling all foreigners as possible spies and traitors had been passed. The extremists gained ground. In April, the mayor of Paris came to the convention in the name of the city and demanded the arrest of a score of members of the convention. The Constitution was completed and presented to the convention, and it was heatedly opposed and indefinitely postponed until the war was over. Hostile armies were marching to suppress the revolution and restore monarchy. The temperature of the land was rising to blood heat. The extremists got the upper hand, and Paine's moderate friends were scattered, confined to their houses or imprisoned. He became sick with foreboding and thought of returning to America. A third nation was failing to realize its ideals. It was a terrible summer. The shadow of the guillotine drew on. Foreigners sought the blood of France, so France began to think of the blood of foreigners and traitors, the real dividing line of the French Revolution, which ought to be doubtly underlined, instead of entirely ignored as it is by every teacher of history, lies in that summer. Paine is historically correct when he speaks of the authors of that terrible system that had turned the character of the Revolution. Candidly, he sought relief in brandy and at times drank to excess. We want no witnesses, for he admitted it. I should have done the same myself. Possibly it was then, in the summer of 1793, that some visitor found a lack of cleanliness. One would not be surprised. Renan, in one of his dialogues, speculates as to the effect upon the moral sentiments of a group of aristocratic prisoners at the time in Paris. Why bother about social law in the face of death? Paine did not go so far, but he consumed much brandy for a few weeks when all his friends passed under the shadow of death. and I can well imagine that he did not brush his clothes every morning. The assassination of Marat, the man of blood, in July seemed to alter the situation. At all events, we have decisive proof that Paine was not soaking in brandy all that summer, as it is precisely then that he wrote the most famous of his books, the first part of The Age of Reason. And the object of the book would astonish some of the preachers who make glib references to Paine. Its purpose was to attack atheism and save religion. Marat Barré, the man who said, "Let us make terror the order of the day," and many other extremists were atheists. So, for that matter, was Paine's friend Danton, who was opposed to them. On the other hand, Robespierre, who ruled France during the Terror, was a deist like Paine. But I show in the book on the French Revolution, Little Blue Book number 1145, that religion had nothing to do with the massacres, and that the government did not interfere with religion until the people compelled it. However, the fatherhood of God was in Paine's creed and the basis of the brotherhood of men, and when he saw atheism spreading, he sat down to refute it. In the circumstances naturally, Paine combined his proof of the existence of God with his reasons for rejecting Christianity, and it is these which have given the book its popularity. An English bishop who set out to refute the book, insofar as it attacks the Bible, admitted incidentally that the theistic passages attained a philosophical sublimity. It is too flattering, yet they might be recommended to the modern preacher, instead of some of the stuff he actually uses. Paine could at least think clearly and realistically, and say plainly what he thought. He lived before science began to offer a natural explanation of things, and so he was impressed by the beauty and order of the universe, leaving the ugliness and disorder and mystery. There was good excuse for him in 1793, though one smiles a little at the construction of proofs of the existence of God in Paris in the days of the Terror, and very little for the people who use his antiquated arguments today. On the other hand, I do not agree with Dr. Conway that in the rationalistic part of the work, Paine is at times too harsh and militant. Conway was the leader of an ethical culture society in London of the constructive and inspirational school. It has its weaknesses. A member of Conway's society, who often saw him privately, said that he has acknowledged, as J.S. Mill and others did, that the old ideal of sex morals could not be fully sustained on a rational basis, but would not venture to say so publicly. In any case, Conway ended, I had a talk with him during his last visit to England, on a note of bitterness and depression. He had underestimated the forces of reaction. Hard fighting is still and long will be necessary until a rational attitude prevails throughout life and a rational liberty is secured. There is no such thing as being too militant. Reaction owes its amazing success to the world in this year of enlightenment, 1927, precisely to the fact that men did not maintain the militancy of Voltaire and Paine. But there is a vast difference between the work of Voltaire and of Paine. Voltaire's anti-Christian writings have in them only the wine and sunshine of France. They sparkle and chuckle and laugh men out of their traditional beliefs. Paine wrote in a somber world. There is reason to think that he first wrote the first part of The Age of Reason in the early part of 1793 for translation into French, and that the manuscript was destroyed. The work as we have it was written during the Terror, for Paine says that he was arrested 6 hours after he had finished it. That was on December 27, 1793. A law had been passed that foreigners should be excluded from all public functions during the war, so he had to leave the convention. It was then easy to arrest him as a private individual and a foreigner. His defense of the king had never been forgotten. When one asks the people who speak of Paine as irreligious why they use this language, they generally refer to the Age of Reason, which they have never seen. The very subtitle of the work is An Investigation of True and Fabulous Theology. It smites the false only to make clearer what Paine regards as the true. And it opens with a solemn profession of belief in God and immortality. Not one of those 6 presidents of the United States whom I study in Little Blue Book number 1203 ever made so plain the earnest a profession of belief in a personal God and personal immortality. Not one ever wrote a paragraph in defense of religion, and Paine's whole book, the very book which ruined his position everywhere, became, because of its attack on religion, is a heartfelt plea for religion. So superficially is the modern apologistic for religion conducted. Conway remarks strangely in one part of his work, Paine was a Christian. In another, he quotes Paine saying, "Had the Christian religion done any good in the world, I would not have exposed it, however fabulous I might believe it to be." That was his spirit. A man who is daily expecting to be hurried off to the guillotine in a public square does not sit down to write a light-hearted dissertation on the eccentricities of belief. Here, in his own words, is his situation. My friends were falling as fast as the guillotine could cut their heads off, and as I expected every day the same fate, I resolved to begin my work. I appeared to myself to be on my deathbed, for death was on every side of me, and I had no time to lose. The people of France were running headlong into atheism, and I had the work translated into their own language to stop them in that career, and fix them to the first article of every man's creed who has any creed at all. I believe in God. Yet writer after writer excuses the neglect, the disdain, almost the suffering caused to Paine in his later years on the grounds that he had penned a superfluous attack on religion. And might be expected to pay for it. What Paine wanted was to save religion. He wrote, he said, on the first page of his work, lest in the general wreck of superstition, of false systems of government, the false theology, we lose sight of morality, of humanity, and of the theology that is true. In other words, Paine attempted in 1793 to do exactly what the most refined and scholarly theologians are doing in every church today. Modernists, they are not. They repeat the position of Paine 130 years ago, and when they say that Paine was coarse or even too harsh and militant, I should conclude that they have never read The Age of Reason. Conway, who had certainly done so, surprises me. I have first read the works through again, and even his temperate censure is unjustified. There is not a phrase in the first and chief part of the work that comes under his description. The work has not the force of common sense. Age and the terrible circumstances explain that. But it has great dignity and is far superior to most arguments for the existence of God. I defy any man to read it and then think that the author was a drunkard. Yet it is only in the summer of 1793 that there is question of Paine's drinking to excess. At the trial in London in 1792, the prosecution had merely elicited the confession of one witness that he once saw Paine the worse for drunk in London. Few gentlemen in London had then so good a record. The dignity of phrasing and the firm reasoning of the Age of Reason show that Paine's admission of excess can only have referred to a short period in the summer of 1793, or to rare occasions. As to militancy, the authorities in England, who for decades prosecuted men for selling the book, could select only 2 short passages from the first part, and they state only, in general terms, that there are obscene pages in the Bible. The second part of The Age of Reason was written in Monroe's house at Paris, and we may presume it was no secret from Monroe. Under happier circumstances, and it deals with the Bible in detail, Paine explains that when he wrote the first part, he had no copy of the Bible. Its criticism is naturally stronger and expressed with more genial disdain. Yet those who talk of coarseness have not read it. Paine was a Puritan. He doesn't not linger over the phallic parts of the Old Testament, but simply dismisses them as obscene, precisely because they are repugnant to him. The many passages quoted by the prosecution to later trials in England do not contain a single coarse expression. The only approach to such is a remark that Mary was, according to Luke, to speak plain language, debauched by a ghost. Even such an expression as this, common enough in the 18th century, is very rare. Paine was attacked at the time simply because his book was anti-Christian, and because it was harsh and militant, and the attack is sustained in our day, when no one troubles about criticisms of the Bible by the false pretense that the work is coarse or scurrilous or harsh. The reverend gentlemen who really think so, after reading it, may be invited to compare the tone of infidel Paine with that of Reverend Dean Swift. Paine's aim was constructive. He wrote for French readers, and he did not need to criticize Christianity for them in 1793 and 1794. His line of reasoning was, I admit with you that all this talk about revolution and a divine church is absurd, but at bottom of it is a religious truth, the existence of God, which I disentangle for you. But let not any person rush to the opposite extreme and say that Paine was not quoted as a witness to the connection of atheism in the September massacres. He's an eyewitness and a profoundly religious man, uses precisely the language which I use in my book, Little Blue Book number 1145, that rationalism inspired the fine early achievements of the Revolution and the Church was responsible for the horrors that ruined it. He says in the preface to the second part, the just and humane principles of the Revolution which philosophy had first diffused had been departed from. The idea, always dangerous to society, as it is derogatory to the Almighty, that priest could forgive sins, though it seemed to exist no longer, had blunted the feelings of humanity and callously prepared man for the commission of all manner of crimes. The intolerant spirit of such prosecutions had transferred itself to politics. The tribunals, styled revolutionary, supplied the place of an inquisition, and the guillotine of the state outdid the fire and faggot of the church. That just analysis of the relation of religion to the revolution is wrong only in the word I have italicized. The victims of the guillotine were a few thousands, of the church several millions. Paine was, as I said, arrested and lodged in the Luxembourg prison on December 27th of 1793. He protested that he was an American citizen and claimed the intervention of America's representative. The free Americans in Paris, America was almost the only friendly nation, protested against the arrest, but were easily evaded, and it fell to Governor Morris, the minister, to act. He made a lukewarm demand for the liberation of Paine and tamely accepted a refusal. Washington, who had been friendly with Paine, was informed, and he did nothing. Paine remained in jail 10 months and nearly lost his life. Whatever we charge to the count of Governor Morris, this is a blot on Washington's career, and it must be remembered in mitigation of Paine's later attack on him. Conway has, however, simply shown that it must be attributed mainly to the personal hostility of Morris. Paine himself, in the preface of his second part, produces a note that he found amongst Robespierre's papers, demanding the arrest of Paine in the interest of America as well as France. Morris surely supplied that interest of America. He detested the Revolution, and he detested Paine, who had corrected his remissness. Whether or no Conway is right, that Morris wanted to breach between America and France, no one can read Morris's cold-blooded letter to America when he recognizes that Paine is in danger of death and fail to see that he was responsible. The apostle of the rights of man in 3 nations, the man who stands almost alone among writers, is sacrificing to the public good all the profit and prestige of an enormous circulation, nearly perished in a Republican jail. He contracted a fever, and only in the generous help of his fellow prisoners pulled him through. At the time he wrote the second part of The Age of Reason, he believed that this prostration saved him from the guillotine. One night 168 men and women were taken out for execution, and Paine's name was on the list. But he later heard a more romantic explanation. The door of his room opened outwards and flat against the wall. In the dim light, he says the man whose business it was to make a mark with chalk on the doors of the condemned did not notice that the door was open, and chalked the inside instead of the outside. It hardly seems plausible, and Conway suggests that the humane doctor of the jail connived at his escape. In 1794, Robespierre fell, and James Monroe succeeded Morris. Monroe at once secured the release of Paine and kept him, nursing him with every regard for a year and a half in his house. When he recovered, Paine went on with his anti-Christian work, and certainly Monroe must have known and sympathized. But we have ample independent evidence that Monroe was a rationalist. The new French leaders made what amends they could by restoring his seat in the convention and offering him a pension. He refused the money, but he returned to the convention to show, he says, I could bear an inquiry without permitting it to injure my principles or my disposition. His character disarmed every Englishman he met. In jail they had loved him, and he later spent some time with Sir Robert and Lady Smith. He was once more happy and honored, though he would have returned to America with Monroe, but for the English ships in the Channel. France was tranquil, except for wars abroad, and lethargic. Paine pleased his friends by writing a very critical pamphlet on the English system of finance, which some years later completely converted Cabot from a fierce patriotic hatred to a great admiration of Paine. The years passed quietly and on eventually. In 1797, Paine founded a deistic society, the Theophilanthropists, but although it was patronized by a member of the Directorate, the new form of government, it had little success. Napoleon came upon the stage, and Paine subscribed to his fund for the invasion of England, thinking that Napoleon would set up free democratic institutions in that country. Napoleon's claws were still hidden. At length, the news came that Thomas Jefferson, his most loyal friend, was president, and Paine received the offer of a passage home on the American ship. With characteristic sensitiveness, he drew back once more when he found it stated in the American press that Jefferson had explained his action as merely the granting of the request of an American citizen. The Federalists were only too prompt to find Jefferson favoring an infidel. The age of reason had reached America. In the autumn of 1802, however, Paine thrilled to find himself once more under the stars and stripes, and on October 30th, he landed at Baltimore. And that is the end of Chapter 4, and I will see you in Part 5 for Chapter 5.